Welcome to Elected, a podcast for women and our active accomplices in politics. I'm your host, Sarah Elger Chaminara. And today, my guest is super fascinating. And I think everyone who's listening to this, I hope you get really excited about what we're going to be talking about. But Wraychel Gilmore is a PhD candidate in, and please correct me if I get this wrong, in adult education and community development with the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T.
That is so impressive because we don't even get it right when we introduce ourselves.
That is very long. I mean, I am like, I didn't memorize that. But I really want to thank you for talking with me today because we're going to be talking about youth in politics. And your work is very fascinating, very relevant, and very cool.
Thanks.
So, do you mind explaining what your field of research is?
Absolutely. And Sarah, thanks so much for the invitation to come on the podcast. We've been, I think, social media fangirls of each other and,
Yes.
sort of side-skirted involvement with each other professionally a bit over the last few years. So I was thrilled at the invitation and thanks so much. Because the area of my research is actually something most people in the general population aren't paying attention to, and especially in politics, not a lot of people are thinking about or talking about. And my whole purpose of doing my research is to look at how we can actually effectively and authentically engage youth in political consultation. So what does that look like? I mean, a lot of times it involves like not-for-profits or charities going to lobby for days on the Hill in Ottawa and talk to politicians about issues that affect youth. A lot of times it's youth having a chance to tell decision makers about the systems that they engage in every day, like education, like the justice system, like child protection, like access to mental health services in rural parts of our country. And they live these things every single day. They're the experts in it. And oftentimes, as adults, we're really quick to make a snap judgment and say, oh, yeah, well, I was 14 one day. I know what it's like to be a teenager. Okay, but I mean, yeah, I was 14 once too, but I wasn't 14 when a global pandemic had just happened. And there's social media filming me and, people putting stuff up on Snapchat after school hours, and bullying continues outside of the classroom. The world's different now. We need to acknowledge that for every generation, especially the one who right now are going through the adolescent years. It is different. They are engaged. They know what their lives are like. They are the experts in what they experience and what government provides for them. So those decision makers who sit in the elected and appointed positions that they have and have a lot of power by sitting there need to stop and pause and hear from youth what it is that needs to change or get better or be totally different. So my research has focused in on, the adults who are doing that, who are actually doing it well, the ones who are sitting in the positions of power, and the advocates in the sector who are helping get those meetings booked and coach everybody through it and make it happen.
I mean, there's so many things that you just said that I find so interesting. I think maybe something that's, the first thing that how do you, youth are smart, they're more engaged because of technology. They're more aware of the world, I think, in different ways than previous generations. I say this as a 41-year-old who sometimes interacts with kids of different ages, but then also as a mom of a 5 and almost 7-year-old. And, we bro each other a lot. And anyways, just the culture is completely different. And their sense of autonomy, which I'm also trying to instill in them, is quite high. So how they move about the world from a very young age as little people is already quite different than I think anything that has happened in the world before. So how do you, so there you have these kids, the consultation piece, how do you how do you get them to advocate for themselves in that way, to be in front of those people to say, you know what, this is my experience in the system and how it's not working for me. How do you move
Yeah.
just having that awareness to, I need to talk to someone who can change that?
Yeah, and it's amazing because a lot of it happens with the opportunity, the opportunity to open doors. And I've found through, the interviews that I've been doing is that it's adults now who had opportunities when they were young
Hmm.
themselves to get heard, to have a chance to say, sit on some committee or go to some meeting or even like talk to, a prime minister, because they visited their school, something that happened where they went, oh my gosh, when I was younger, that person who made decisions listened to me.
Mhm.
And so now I want to be one of those adults who helps make that happen or who is more open and receptive and curious about hearing from what these young people say. So there's kind of like prep that needs to happen for the adult in their mentality, right? Is that are they coming at this curious? Are they coming at it with a sense of humanity that these are voices that actually do need to be heard? And on the youth side, there's often very little prep happening because it is raw, because it is real. Um, oftentimes, like myself, as an advocate in the sector for youth services and colleagues, we all, you sit around and debrief things afterwards, and people will always comment like, "Oh, those youth felt so scripted," or "Did they really prepare that statement themselves?" Or how much did you give them of that? Did they really know that background? And time again, myself and my colleagues, we shake our head and say, they knew that. They owned that. That was their story. That that was their voice. And it's still a surprise to a lot of adults because youth are stereotyped, right? By they're not competent, they're not engaged, they're apathetic.
We
Have you listened?
infantilize them. Right?
Completely. It's a paternalistic system, right?
Yeah.
And it's still one our political system, and your listeners know this. It's still a political system that is founded and runs on patriarchy
Yeah.
of gender and power. And ageism is actually something that I found in my literature review, Sarah, that is not even mentioned as an element of marginalization in
Really?
politics. Absolutely. This is the fun part is that, people look at who's marginalized from political consultation, and it's the list is who you would expect, indigenous communities, newcomers, immigrant families, children who experience, or sorry, not children, but families who experience systemic racism in education. But in those lists and in the academic work that's happening, and even in the sector, in practical real life, when we're talking, the fact that young people are not even listed as marginalized shows how disenfranchised they are from the political system.
100%. 100%. I mean, yeah, that makes, I'm not, as shocking as it is, I'm not shocked,
Yeah,
right? Because, yeah, that's,
yeah,
why would you include kids when you don't think that they have anything to share?
exactly. I mean,
Based
it's
on
made for
their
some really juicy research. There's been a lot of stuff, a lot
Okay,
of angles and directions to go in.
so like, who did you meet as a child that
Oh,
took you in this direction, or what happened to lead you down this path and choose this as
oh,
your subject of research?
yeah. I think for me, Sarah, it was the fact that my like education and then my professional career, they propelled very quickly at a very young age for me. I fast tracked through high school. I was in university at 17. I was an executive director at the age of 30 with 6,000 youth in a program like province wide in Ontario that I ran, 2,000 volunteers that I had to manage risk management and training for, a staff of 20 across the whole province. I was engrossed in the youth sector when I was still really young myself.
Hmm.
And when you have to go toe to toe against federal ministers, for funding or even for the ethics of how you run your program when you're still in your 20s, um, it schooled me. It really taught me about voice and about what it took to be able to communicate effectively in the political sphere. And ironically, as my research was developing and I finished my master's and I came back later and thought about a PhD, I had a lot of people in the academic world try to push me towards talking to other colleagues who did like early childcare education or social work, which is very feminized in terms of sectors and professions. And I said, well, no, actually, for the last 25 years, I've been playing, and pardon the sexist pun, but I've been playing with the big boys. I've been playing politics because I realized at a young age, you also need to know how to get your funding application read, how to curate a relationship with an elected official, how to do national level crisis public communications work to amplify the voices of those you're serving, of children and youth. So you have to play politics. And so I think I had opportunities very, very young myself to play politics in the name of advancing the rights of children and youth.
Hmm. So the rights of children and youth in political consultation, like I mean, you could say that like literally everything touches youth and
Yeah.
children. But are there specific areas that are most of interest to you in your research um,
Yeah, and I think like I can tell you a great story about sort of what sparked this whole idea was shortly after former Premier Bob Ray became elected, or not elected, I'm sorry, appointed as our ambassador to the UN.
okay.
It was a few weeks after that. It was making news, here's this like big position, it's been appointed. And a group of youth that I was their liaison for out of a child and youth advocate office, the news caught their attention because we'd been talking about their rights in the United Nations and the convention. And they were very well schooled up in, where the decision makers sat in terms of whether or not issues got talked about, like clean water or environmental concerns about having enough trees in schoolyards and a national lunch program through the education system and living in foster homes and group homes during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, like access to mental health is a massive issue.
Oh, it
So
crisscrosses political level.
yeah, exactly. Like it crisscrosses all these issues. So these youth said, well, we want to talk to that guy. We want to talk to this guy who's going to go represent Canada and sit at the UN because he should know what we think about these issues, about our rights. I'm like, okay. So long story short, we get this orchestrated. We're having a Zoom consultation. He's sitting in his office in New York. He's got the flags behind him, Canada and the blue UN flag. It's looking all shiny. We'd prepped as youth, not scripted, but we'd prepped as to which core issue each youth was going to stand up and come to the camera and talk about and share with the ambassador. And he was very receptive. The first few went very well. He went, okay, great. Yep, got that. Okay, yep, that's a priority. And one youth came up and she completely went off of the direction that we had talked about and planned for. And she took that moment to say, you know what? I am standing in front of a decision maker. And I'm going to take the chance to share some very raw trauma about what my experience with mental health has been like during the pandemic and living in the care of child protection services. And as I watched this happen, the ambassador, like watching his body language, he sat back in his chair. His hand went up to his chin. His finger went in front of his lips, almost to like physically silence himself. And he listened. And then when she was done speaking, it was like the whole rest of the room dropped away. It was just the two of them on camera with each other. And then he responded to her. He came forward, he leaned in, his hand went down, And he shared what he shared publicly and in other places about his own mental health struggles in his 20s and the crisis that he went through and the adversity and how important that was in shaping who he became. And all of a sudden, for this young girl to hear the ambassador to the UN sit in front of her and say, I also was where you were, and I understand how important it is you get the help you need. That was an adult learning from a youth during a political consultation. And that was my snapshot. I literally took a screenshot and I opened my presentations with it. And I tell this story because when I talked to the ambassador, I said, that's what I wanted to discover, how we make more of happen in this country. How do we get more adults to sit back, share their power, have a moment of silence, and truly reflect and respond to the tragedies that children and youth are experiencing in this country on a daily basis? Because only the decision makers can move forward, changing regulations, updating policies,
Yeah.
advancing new legislation. The youth can't do that. So we all need to do this work together. This has to be an intergenerational movement.
Well, it makes me actually think, I mean, I got goosebumps when you were sharing that. And it makes me think there was a story I actually saw on social media and I shared it on like an Instagram stories for Madam Premier. It was like New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs saying something about, you know, the education system, you know, being a mess or something. My comment was, if only he knew someone who was able to do something about that. You're
Yeah,
telling me that you've identified an issue. Like, who are you? Like,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know
yeah,
do you have the
yeah.
like do you know who you are? If only you could like walk down the hall and, you know, talk to somebody about that. But sure, like it was mind-boggling to me. But that power that people do have, and I think it sometimes gets lost on them, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you don't realize that because systems are systems and everything takes so long and there's so many processes and so many people and it's hard to do things quickly sometimes, but you still have the ability to make things happen. So uh so that's an amazing conversation that you had with the ambassador of of Canada to the UN. But you said that I think you've done a lot of consultation with different people. Who else is in your roster of research, your research Rolodex?
Oh, it has been a phenomenal response, Sarah. Like this is what has been blowing me away the last sort of 6 months of folks that I've asked and have said yes and have like waived the ethics of confidentiality that one has to do when they're doing university research to say, use my name, tell my stories, um, because they're proud of their work. And this whole endeavor, my point of my research is to amplify those of us in the sector and in politics who do care about this and are doing it well. So I was blown away that the ambassador himself also agreed to an actual academic interview. So he and I could sit for an hour and actually discuss this and pick it apart and needle at it. I had an amazing conversation with Senator McFedrin, who is a champion of feminist rights and human rights and youth rights, advocating to lower the voting age in Canada. Senator Stan Kushner, who's also working on repealing Section 43 of the Criminal Code, because in Canada, we still have a defense to use corporal punishment against children. Not a lot of people know that. So that could be a whole other hour conversation we could have. Robert Crampton is actually the executive director of the Prime Minister's Youth Council. We sat down for an hour together on Zoom. Great insights from him on, you know, how he has to toe the line as a civil servant and amplify youth voice within government. And folks from the sector, you might remember, I think today actually, the latest roster of Order of Canada nominees came out. But last summer, Irwin Elman was granted his Order of Canada. And Irwin was Ontario's first and only, before defunded, child and youth advocate and is a huge player in advocating for the rights, especially of youth coming out of care. Two folks, Kate Butler and Terrence Hamilton, are colleagues in the field who were actually contracted by the federal government to host the youth consultations when Canada had to write its last report to the UN about how we're actually upholding children's rights, they had phenomenal stories to share. And just like a few others, like Ilona Doherty founded Apathy is Boring after
Mm.
herself had the experience as a youth, being part of Canada's first delegation as a youth to the UN. Dana Kenny from the East Coast, he was the original cohort of the Prime Minister's Youth Council and then transitioned to work for the Youth Secretariat and now still works for the federal government. So folks that have been committed and entrenched and have fires in their belly about these issues and have been at it for decades. I mean, I was worried I wouldn't have enough people to talk to, but every time I sat down with someone, it was always the response, "Hey, have you connected yet with," or "Hey, have you talked to?" I'm like, "No, that'd be great, awesome." And so my roster, as you said, this Rolodex of very high profile national figures who are committed to ensuring that youth have a voice in politics and that consultations happen with them. It's been an amazing last few months of doing these interviews. I had 23 in total that I did over a 9-week period. So my head was spinning with gratitude and as you said, with goosebumps, because a lot of them we ended in tears. We ended. I mean, I had a confidential interview that ended with the person pausing to thank me, to say, "I really appreciated just having the space to talk about the motivation as to why I do this work." And they had gotten into this work because a friend in high school had been shot and, in their words, murdered by Toronto Police Services because they were having a mental health crisis. So often the reasons the adults are making space for youth are very personal. And so to capture from them their motivation so that we can get more of it, so that we can create more opportunities without tragedy and come from this as a strength-based approach, that's what we're all trying to do.
Well, I mean, and that's like that echoes for me the change that I want to see in politics more broadly by, seeing more women at the table, by seeing, different people with different experiences of education, of intersectionality,
Mhm.
because that's how we're going to change how decisions are made, right? Like,
Mhm.
so that's so important. That's so fundamental, I think. And I mean, you touched on, like, I would love to, actually, maybe you can put me in touch with someone or suggest, because I would love to do a podcast dedicated to lowering the voting age to 16.
Oh,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, because I'd love to explore that more, because that's something that, if not, uh, if not something that happens federally, I'd love to see that actually happen at a municipal level.
Well, the go-to person is Dave Meslin. Happy to connect you.
Yeah.
He's the founder of Unlock Democracy. He's got a great book,
Oh,
and he is a special advisor to Senator McFedrin on the
okay.
issue. And they just had a massive summit, the first one
Oh,
in Ottawa, on lowering the voting age. So if you follow Vote 16, I'm going to give him a plug on
oh
your
yeah. No, I
podcast.
do
Vote
actually.
16.
Yeah, I do
Yeah,
actually.
great initiatives, and they are all about not just a federal initiative but lowering the voting age at all levels.
Yeah.
Good connections are there in relationships in Austria, where voting age has actually been 16 for a generation. So there's
Well,
lots of international examples of where it works and how it actually increases democracy and voter turnout.
I actually did a youth exchange when I was 15 to Germany, and they have different voting ages there, even,
Yeah,
which is kind of like the first time I was exposed to that, because I was like, what do you mean people around my age, can vote?
yeah,
Right? Like, anyways,
yeah.
uh,
Changes your value in society.
it does. It does. You're you're giving people the franchise, right? Which
Completely. I
is
mean,
like, we're so
when
often we're disenfranchising people, you know, like, what if we did the opposite?
Well, it's ironic. I sometimes use the line, and people look at me like I have three heads, and then they think about it. Youth are the only citizens left in our country who are taxed without representation.
Yeah.
Because we pump out summer jobs funding, we get them all employed when they're 15 years old, they have deductions, yet they cannot vote. But at the
Well,
same
that
time,
that reminds me of a period of time where women were in the same position, right?
yeah. And
And
all the same arguments are used against why women couldn't vote, now are being used against why youth can't vote. Somebody else will influence your opinion. You're not competent enough or knowledgeable enough to make an informed decision. Like, come on.
I know that it drives me, well, I mean, and that's like a different angle of it is, because sometimes people can challenge me on like, well, why is Madam Premier multi-partisan, like in your advocacy for women in politics? And it's like, well, because as a woman, um, who women in general have not always been, have been disenfranchised historically. I am not about to disenfranchise someone else, even if I disagree with them. Right. Like for me,
Mm-hmm.
that is a lie. That's a fundamental building block. Like you don't, but so in that same way, why would we disenfranchise youth?
Exactly.
Okay. I hope
Exactly.
everyone is like thinking about this right now as they listen to it and are like, oh my gosh, this was a light bulb moment. Um,
Here's hoping.
yeah. Um, Also on the global kind of thing, you mentioned Austria. What is the
Mm-hmm.
global interest in your research?
This has been sort of the surprise experience of doing this PhD, Sarah. Honestly, I'm pinching myself on a daily basis because it's sort of part of the PhD journey. Is that when you come to the point of having conducted some interviews or you have some preliminary ideas about what the whole point of what you're writing might say, you kind of try to get a couple conferences and share like and get some feedback and think, okay, how do I make it better? How do I change it? And so the response when I've put my research out there as something I can come and share and talk about has been stunningly overwhelming. In the last few months already, I've been to international academic conferences in Miami. I just got back from Sweden, where I presented. I leave the week after next for Greece for a university presentation there. And then I finish this month with a presentation at Cornell University in New York State. And in these audiences, when I'm arriving, there are colleagues from Australia, South Africa, the UK. This young academic came up to me from Singapore in Sweden, and I was brought to tears almost by his comments. He's like, "Your research is my dream."
Mm,
There is no engagement for youth politically in Singapore, or only the advantaged youth have an opportunity to be heard if they go to certain schools or have certain parents. So, at a global level, there's still this shine on Canada that we are a human rights defender. Internally, our ranking is not good. It's part of why I'm doing this work is that we actually know there's a lot of areas we are falling drastically short, and the
yeah.
level of poverty we allow children to live in this country is
Appalling.
devastating, appalling. Um, but when you say on an international academic stage, here's somebody who's going to talk about how youth are activating their human rights in Canada on the political landscape, everybody's turning out to want to hear about us. And I say us because it's not me. I am simply the vessel, having the experience in this sector to amplify the voices of everyone who's agreed to have an interview with me and share their experiences and share the things that have emotionally impacted them and changed their viewpoint on how they write policy, how they go forward with legislation. So I consider it an absolute privilege and a humbling honor to be able to go to these places. Crossing the Atlantic has become my new commute this year.
Mm.
And it's just been phenomenal to have this dialogue happen at a global level and see the interest that other countries are also having in tidbits we can share with each other on things that work, things that go well, tactics that seem to play out. Because human nature is human nature. And almost all of us have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So every one of the countries that has, we all have a reason to do well in this because, internationally, we actually have to go get a report card every 5 to 8 years on how we're doing. And nobody wants to be embarrassed. And 2 years ago, Canada got really embarrassed. We had a very poor presentation of how we think we're upholding children's rights in this country. And we got schooled. So there's a lot of work to do. And I don't go out to these countries and present what Canada is doing as being the perfect solution for everyone. No way, no how.
You
But
think
at the
that,
end,
do you think that that reporting or that ranking will be different the next time it happens for Canada
oh,
based
I would
on
like it to. I
this
mean,
year
morally, ethically,
Yeah.
yeah, morally and ethically, I would
Well,
like us to
yeah.
be doing better for our children.
For the
But
reality, for children living
yeah,
in Canada, we would hope, right,
we would
that we're doing
hope.
better.
I think it's twofold, Sarah. Having had the privilege of looking at these processes through an academic research lens, I can see that our problem with our ranking is twofold. It's first how we are actually doing, the reality of things like we have children living at an abysmal level, as we said, below the poverty line. There are boil water advisories. There is not access to basic needs. So there's that. But there's also how we collect the data
Mm.
because of, the favorite word that we all roll our eyes out at is jurisdictional issues. Right? That there's these jurisdictional issues with
Maybe
youth
I should put that
services.
on a mug.
Yeah, let's all roll our eyes at jurisdictional issues. Because federally, I think the count now is there's like 8 different ministries who have some mandate in some way, shape, or form to serve children and youth. But then that service delivery actually happens at the provincial and territorial level. And then there's still accountabilities at municipal levels. So we all have to not only do better, but we actually have to report better
Mm.
and get our data and our evidence to showcase this is what we're doing. So I would hope if we could collect things better, 2 things would happen.
The provinces doing the same thing despite their individual jurisdictions. I mean, is this a fever dream?
Well, I mean, yeah, but look at what we've seen in the last few years, even, right? That there's been this dabbling at the federal level into things that we would have said were provincial and territorial, like um, daycare, like childcare, like early education, like school lunch programs. Like, okay, education's provincial and territorial, but feeding our children
You're
is
speaking
kind
to
of a
someone in
national
Alberta,
responsibility.
so yes, it's complicated. It's complicated, let's say.
It's always complicated.
So
I,
complicated.
my hope would be not only would we collect better data, but when we collect better data, we would also see truly where our deficiencies are
Yeah.
and focus our attention, our legislation, and our funding towards making those real improvements.
Well, I think, collecting the data is one thing. How it's collected, the language
Mm-hmm.
used and how it's collected.
Mm-hmm.
But also how is it reported, right?
Yeah. Who's
Um,
analyzing it?
who's analyzing it, and what level of transparency is there in that?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, in the same way that expression, the glass half full or half empty. Someone evaluating data will see that cup as half empty and present it as so. Someone else will see that glass with the same amount of water and say it's half full and present it as so. And then the people who either get the data of either half full or half empty will then be like, yeah, the glass is half full or half empty.
Yeah.
Right. And then they go out through the world. So, there's just so much to unpack with that. And it's like it's a little bit like, if you've ever like watched kittens with a ball of string or something. It's like that to me is what kind of like that interjurisdictional relationship is like.
And I think that's why I have felt the last 6 months, entrenched in this work and gathering
Yeah.
all of these stories. I have felt like I've become a bit of a conspiracy theorist
Hmm.
because I've been seeing things with all of these lenses in front of me and being able to pause and look at the landscape and go, oh my goodness, are all the decision makers not aware of all of these factors? And the truth is, they're not. They don't have the time or capacity to take it all in. And that
Or,
is or are choosing not to.
or yes, I was going to say, or if I was to be like a conspiracy theorist or have worked in government for political ministers, I would say it's an intentional suppression.
Mm-hmm. Ignorance is bliss, isn't that a saying?
Yes, it is. And I understand
Mm-hmm.
it is bliss, but choosing it is very problematic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's some of these issues and topics, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of repealing Section 43 of the Criminal Code, right? When you unpack that for people, and I share that with others in different education sectors, they're appalled. They say there's no way that Canada can still have that on the books. I'm like, yeah, it dates back to the 1870s. But you know what's even more scary is the fact that we are now on our 18th legal attempt to repeal it. So
Hmm.
what does that say about our choices?
Well, I wish I could say some. I mean, I go between optimist and pragmatist, and then just to a very deep, dark well of
Uh-huh.
despair. Um, I mean, I think anyone who watches politics will see that, the government spends a lot of money and a lot of time not doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and someone's telling them that that's a good idea. I think there
Mm-hmm.
need to be more people in positions of power who say that's not a good idea and we're not going to do that anymore.
And that will cost you votes because this segment
Yeah.
of the population wants a certain level of protection.
Exactly. But heaven forbid we had, political leaders and political parties and just political systems that were about doing the right thing, even if it wasn't about winning votes. Like,
Or just doing it because it's intrinsically the right thing to do for children and youth. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, like I mentioned, the announcements that have come out the last few years, and I don't know how many times I read a press release that talked about, the $10 a day daycare and how it was a mobilizer for women and the economy and the workforce. And little voices in my brain would start to scream. I'm like, how about it's just a good idea for young children's socialization and emotional development? Can't that be enough of a reason why it's good for children to have access to daycare? Is that not valid enough? But it's not. Not when you're making a political announcement.
yeah. Well, I mean, actually, before we started recording this podcast, I had a conversation with someone who works in the field of education and is a former teacher. And, we talked about, how the system is funded and who the decision makers are and the differences between the different systems and private versus Catholic versus, because in
Mm-hmm.
Alberta, we have a publicly funded Catholic system. Um, like there's just so much of that. And so much of it is, you're right, it's about, the adults in the room. It's not about the
Mm-hmm.
kids in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll even say,
Always.
as a parent, who's been in meetings discussing my children, right? And they their humanity is lost.
Yeah.
It's actually, I would say that's something that I found actually disgusting,
Yeah.
as a parent, is the way in which our children, like we talk about, they can be talked about by people who, and who do care about them in different ways, but so clinically around,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes away from who they are as a whole person.
100%.
Yeah.
Every time. Yeah.
Yeah. So we do need to find ways to remember that they are people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to not disenfranchise them.
Mm-hmm.
I find this is so fascinating. I could talk to you for so long. If you ever end up in Calgary, like please, I would. love, and I think there would be so many people who would be interested in hearing from you, and
Amazing.
because your research is just so fascinating.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a huge compliment. Yeah, I love coming anywhere in Canada. So if the
Yeah, if anyone
opportunity
is
presents
listening,
itself,
yes, you'll travel.
I
Have
will. I
research,
will.
you'll travel.
Exactly. Yeah, let's chat.
Yeah, okay, that's amazing. So if anyone is interested in your research, how do they get in contact with you?
Honestly, the easiest way to find me is through my LinkedIn page. I'm right on there, Wraychel Gilmore. It's just the weird spelling of my first name. I know this is audio, so I'll spell it for you: Wraychel. There's a Ray and there's a Chel, and then Gilmore, exactly as it sounds. So yeah, find me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM. I love connecting with colleagues across all child and youth serving sectors and politics, because this is really about consultation of marginalized people in our community. And my specialty happens to be for youth.
Yeah. That's great. I think this was a really fascinating chat. And yeah, I hope you keep pursuing this. And I hope that Canada, you know, not just because, for some people a report card is just like an indication that everything is like surface level okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, we are, as a nation, as provinces and territories, as communities, actually making the lives of children and youth better, not
Yeah,
just to have, be perceived, in the world as doing better, but actually doing better
exactly.
for them. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. I think we're on the cusp of some great social change in a lot of directions. But it's going to take those of us that have the fire in the belly to get vocal. And I heard from another advocate. She has a sort of her own area of specialty as well. But when we have those moments where we kind of get beat up and think about how heavy the boulders are that we're trying to move in society, her advice to me was just get used to talking to very small rooms over
Mm,
and over and over and over and over again.
yeah.
Okay, that's a good perspective. It's not going to be a lightning bolt change of societal attitude towards youth, but it's going to be a lot of conversations like this, Sarah. So I thank you so much for the chance
Oh,
to
yeah.
at least bring it to your listeners,
Yeah.
and hopefully they're sitting in a very small room, but they share it with someone else too.
Yeah. I definitely think that this conversation will move them in different ways. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.